The Young and the Restless Spoilers Shock. The war between Victor Newman and his growing list of enemies had never been so vicious, so devastatingly personal, and so dangerously unhinged. What once resembled a high-stakes chess game of corporate maneuvers and family power plays had now morphed into an uncontrollable wildfire fueled by betrayal, paranoia, and unrelenting ambition. The battlefield was no longer confined to the boardrooms of Newman Enterprises or the lush corridors of the Abbott mansion. It had spilled out into the shadows, into whispered threats and covert alliances where lives were being wagered like poker chips and bloodlines no longer offered protection. Victor, a titan forged in the crucible of ruthless business and strategic warfare, found himself encircled by enemies not just eager to see him fall but determined to bury his legacy in ashes. And at the center of this storm stood Aristotle Dumas, a figure shrouded in mystery, operating from the darkness like a phantom puppeteer pulling strings that reached deeper and farther than anyone could have imagined. He never showed his face, never stepped into the public eye. His presence was known only through the commanding echo of his voice, low, deliberate, and drenched in power, emanating from encrypted calls and intercepted transmissions. It was this voice that summoned chaos, that recruited the disillusioned, the desperate, the power-hungry men and women who had been bruised by Victor's long reign and were now ripe for rebellion. And among those drawn into his web was Billy Abbott. Billy had spent years fighting for recognition, for a sense of worth that extended beyond the shadows of his family name or the judgment of his peers. Time and again, he had clawed his way up only to be reminded by the media, by his siblings, by Victor himself, that he would never be enough. That he would always be the wild card, the loose cannon, the disappointment. So when Aristotle approached him, not with mockery but with validation, with opportunity, Billy listened. The offer was simple and sinister: sever ties with the Abbott family, walk away from Sally Spectra and the semblance of stability she offered, and embrace a new purpose. A war was coming, and Billy could choose to be a soldier of consequence or another casualty of indecision. For the first time in a long while, Billy felt needed. More than that, he felt chosen. And that feeling, intoxicating and reckless, eclipsed the guilt that should have stopped him. Aristotle, meanwhile, was ecstatic to have someone like Billy on his side. Not just because of his proximity to the Abbotts or his deep-seated resentment toward Victor, but because Billy represented a gateway to emotional warfare. Aristotle understood that the real power lay not in the destruction of Newman Enterprises' assets but in the dismantling of Victor's world from the inside out. With Billy's betrayal and access, the fractures could deepen. And yet, that was only the beginning. Aristotle had secrets, dangerous secrets, and one of them was about to unleash a new level of chaos, because it involved Nick Newman. Nick had always been the steady one in Victor's empire, the son who once rebelled but always came home, the bridge between Victor's ruthless ambition and the family's bruised humanity. But when Aristotle's voice slithered through the line of a secure call, Nick's world tilted. The message wasn't a threat, it was an invitation. But its terms were drenched in madness. Aristotle didn't want Nick to merely distance himself from Victor, he wanted him to take the final step, to sever the head of the dragon. Symbolically, yes, but dangerously close to literally. Nick's heart pounded as Aristotle laid out the rationale: how Victor's empire was corrupt beyond redemption, how the patriarch's reign had destroyed countless lives, and how Nick was destined to rise, not as a son in the shadow but as a man of independent power. Nick, despite his fury at his father's manipulation in the past, recoiled. This was beyond business, beyond revenge. This was blood turning on blood, and the thought sent a chill down his spine. He tried to play it cool on the call, masking his unease, but the moment it ended, he felt the weight of the moment crash down upon him. Who was this man really? What did he know? How deep had Aristotle infiltrated their lives, their minds, their family dinners, their whispered conversations behind closed doors? Was Billy really gone to the other side, or was there still a piece of him left to save? As the days ticked on, Victor began sensing the pressure, an invisible force closing in from all sides. Deals were collapsing without explanation. Trusted advisors were suddenly unavailable. There were whispers of loyalty being bought, of surveillance systems being breached. He didn't know the full scope of the betrayal yet, but he felt its presence like a noose tightening around his neck. And his instincts, sharper than ever, told him this wasn't just another business rival. This was personal. This was war. And someone was coming not just for his company, but for his life. Behind closed doors, Aristotle continued orchestrating the downfall of a man he viewed as a relic, a symbol of corruption that needed to be purged. He moved his pawns with meticulous precision, keeping his identity locked beneath layers of security and proxies. But the cracks were beginning to show. The deeper he pulled Billy into the fold, the more unstable Billy became, tormented by the dissonance between loyalty and legacy. And Nick, now on edge, began pulling away from his family in subtle ways, canceling meetings, avoiding family dinners, disappearing for hours at a time. The seeds were taking root. But what no one had anticipated was the wild card yet to be played, Sally. Hurt, confused, and sensing something far darker in Billy's distance than just emotional coldness, she began her own quiet investigation. It wouldn't be long before she discovered Aristotle's name, and once that thread began to unravel, the entire war could ignite in full force. Victor was preparing for retaliation, but how do you fight an enemy you cannot see? How do you defend your family when the betrayal comes from within, cloaked in smiles and sealed with blood? The walls were closing in. The battlefield was no longer visible. It was everywhere. And somewhere in the shadows, Aristotle Dumas waited, watching, calculating, and ready to strike again. The line between right and wrong had long since blurred for Billy Abbott. What began as a desperate attempt to reclaim self-worth and carve out a legacy distinct from the shadows of Jack and John had twisted into something grotesque, something irreversible. Aristotle Dumas no longer merely offered him power, he demanded allegiance, absolute and deadly. The final order had arrived, unshrouded in metaphor or subtlety. Billy was to eliminate Victor Newman. Not sabotage his empire, not expose a scandal, but kill him. The words, though delivered in that cold, calculating tone through a secure call, still reverberated in Billy's skull like a war drum. There was no ambiguity, no alternate interpretation. Either Victor died by Billy's hand, or Billy would face consequences so severe that even his darkest fears would seem merciful by comparison. And yet, the promise that followed was equally staggering. Should Billy succeed, Aristotle assured him, he would be reborn. Not as the black sheep of the Abbott family, not as the failed executive or the unreliable partner, but as a kingmaker, a ruler in his own right. No longer living in Jack's shadow. No longer mocked by the Newmans. No longer questioned, doubted, or pitted. He would be feared. Respected. And finally, seen. Sally sensed it all slipping away. The man she loved, the one who once fought for redemption, who once clung to empathy and second chances, had become a stranger. She had pleaded with him, begged him to turn back before the path consumed him completely. She had touched his face with trembling hands and whispered truths only a soulmate could say, "This isn't you." But Billy's eyes, once bright with rebellion and mischief, had gone cold. He no longer flinched at the mention of murder. He no longer spoke of future dreams or building something together. All that remained was the mission and the voice of a man he had never even met in person guiding his every breath. Sally stood alone in the aftermath of their final argument, her voice hoarse from shouting, her heart shattered from watching the man she loved slip into madness. She didn't understand, why had he allowed himself to be poisoned like this? What part of him had believed that any of this was worth it? She suspected, in some painful way, that Aristotle had promised Billy the one thing she never could, an end to the question of his worth. And for that, Billy was willing to cross the final line. Phyllis Summers, however, was not a woman blinded by sentiment. Her connection to Aristotle Dumas was equally disturbing, though born from different motives. She, too, had pledged loyalty to the Phantom Man, but her reasons were shrouded in curiosity and calculated ambition. Phyllis was no fool. She recognized that Aristotle was dangerous, that he operated with ruthless efficiency and had no qualms about using people as disposable pieces in his war. And yet, she couldn't help herself. There was something almost magnetic about the mystery. Who was this man who commanded such loyalty, who manipulated lives from behind a curtain of encrypted calls and secret codes? Why was he targeting Victor so specifically, and how had he managed to dig his claws into Genoa City so deeply without ever showing his face? Phyllis didn't want to kill anyone. Not yet. But she wanted answers. She wanted to be at the table when the truth was revealed, when Aristotle finally unveiled himself, when the mask came off, and the man behind the chaos was forced into the light. Until then, she would play her role, offer allegiance, and pretend to be another pawn in his growing army. But she had her own game, her own endgame. And it didn't involve going down with the rest of them. Meanwhile, Billy prepared for the unthinkable. He rehearsed the moment in his head, again and again. How he would lure Victor into a secluded space. How he would say something to distract him. How he would strike, quickly, efficiently. He tried to picture Victor's face, not as the larger-than-life titan of Genoa City, but as a mortal man who could bleed. Who could fall. But each time he imagined it, a wave of nausea rose in his gut. No matter how many times Aristotle reinforced the idea that this was justice, not murder, Billy could not escape the truth: he was about to kill a man. And not just any man, Victor Newman, his family's greatest rival, yes, but also a symbol of power, of legacy, of the very structure that had defined all their lives. He had crossed the point of no return, and all that remained now was the fall. The early morning sunlight filtered through the large front windows of crimson lights, casting a warm glow on the mismatched furniture and lending a cozy, almost magical quality to the coffee house that had, over the years, become a center of community life in Genoa City. Regular patrons sipped their lattes and perused the local paper, but amidst the low murmur of conversation and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, one young man's arrival set the entire room abuzz. Daniel Romalotti Jr. Recently returned to town after months on tour with his band, slung his guitar case over his shoulder with a casual confidence that belied the whirlwind of emotion roiling inside him. As he stepped into the shop, the familiar faces, the eclectic decor, and the faint hum of music playing softly from the cafe's speakers stirred a flood of memories he hadn't anticipated. Memories of childhood summers spent chasing ice cream trucks, of late-night study sessions in the local library with Christine Blair, and of the proud, protective presence of his father, Danny Romalotti. It was only a matter of moments before Daniel noticed two figures approaching him through the crowd: Danny himself, rock star turned private citizen. Leaning on a familiar leather jacket and matching guitar slung over his back as though it were an extension of his very being, and beside him, Christine Blair, her bright smile illuminating her face, eyes glistening with pride and a touch of nostalgia. As Daniel's gaze locked onto his father's, his breath caught in his throat. Memories surged. Hearing Danny's voice on the radio for the first time as a toddler, feeling the thrum of the guitar strings beneath his small fingers when his father let him strum along to a familiar chord progression, the sense that Danny's love had anchored him through every turbulent moment of his youth. Now, seeing him older, but no less vibrant, wearing a look of uncontainable joy, Daniel felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. Danny, for his part, wore an expression of disbelief, as though he were momentarily convinced he was dreaming. He stepped forward, setting aside his guitar case and sweeping his son into an embrace that seemed to radiate the years of absence, pride, and unconditional love all at once. Christine, watching the reunion with tears in her own eyes, extended her arms in welcome. Daniel enveloped her in a hug that spoke of gratitude. For Christine's unwavering support during his family's most trying times, for the countless afternoons she had spent helping him with homework or simply listening when he needed someone to talk to. The three of them stood in that embrace for what felt like an eternity as the other patrons looked on with envy and admiration, sensing that they had witnessed a rare and beautiful moment. A homecoming not just of a prodigal son, but of a fragmented family stitched back together by love and resilience. "Dad," Daniel whispered, his voice choking with emotion as he pulled back to look up at his father. "I can't believe you're here." Danny's eyes shimmered with tears, and he ruffled Daniel's hair. A gesture that brought back flashes of Daniel's childhood, when his father would touzle his hair playfully after hearing him hit the high notes of a Mariah Carey song in the back seat of the family car. "Son, I wouldn't miss this for the world," Danny replied, his roughened voice tender with emotion. "When I heard you were playing here, I had to see it for myself. I've got the best seat in the house." Christine stepped closer, gently taking Daniel's shoulder. "Genoa City isn't the same without you," she said. "We've all missed you more than you know." Daniel swallowed hard, his heart aching with gratitude. "It's been a wild ride out there on tour," he admitted. "But being back here, it feels like I'm breathing properly again." As the three of them shared that intimate moment, Daniel's bandmates slipped into the shop one by one, instruments in tow, ready to set up for the evening's show. From across the room, one of them nudged another, quietly pointing out the huddle of Romolatis. Their whispered speculations spread quickly. Is that Danny Romolati? And Christine Blair with him? Is Daniel Jr. back in Genoa City? Soon enough, half the patrons had their phones trained on the trio, screens raised like digital lighthouses, capturing the moment for posterity. But Daniel hardly noticed. His entire world had narrowed down to the faces in front of him. His father, his godmother, his family once more. "Okay, you have to tell me," Daniel said after a moment, managing a shaky laugh as he glanced between his father and Christine. "Did I have to be on some VIP list to know you were coming, or did you slip in on a secret tour bus?" He attempted a light tone, but his voice cracked, betraying the swell of emotion beneath. Danny laughed, the sound rich with relief and love. "I might have pulled some strings," he admitted, winking at Christine. "I wouldn't have forgiven myself if I'd missed seeing you perform again." Christine shook her head emphatically. "You'd tell me if you were coming, right?" she teased, though there was a softness in her eyes that said she already knew the answer. Both of them had felt a restless tug at their hearts when they hadn't heard from Daniel in weeks. A part of them had feared he would lose himself in the endless cycle of shows, sleepless nights, and the intoxicating allure of life on the road. But here he was, standing tall, arms wrapped around the two most important figures in his life, safe in the one place that felt like home. That evening, after setting up their equipment under the warm glow of Crimson Light's pendant lamps, Daniel returned to the small green park adjacent to the coffee house. It was there, under a grand oak tree whose gnarled limbs stretched like welcoming arms, that another scene was unfolding. A scene that, unbeknownst to Daniel, was just as fraught with emotional tension and raw vulnerability as his own family's reunion. Tessa Porter, a gifted musician and longtime friend, sat on a stone bench, her guitar perched against her knee. Despite her outward composure, a flicker of anxiety danced in her eyes as she watched Mariah Copeland's figure approach, her footsteps hesitant and heavy with unspoken turmoil. Tessa had learned more about Mariah's secret than anyone else in Genoa City. Secrets that weighed on Mariah like a millstone, threatening to shatter everything she had built. Tessa's heart ached for her friend, who had always been a rock for others, an unwavering presence in the face of chaos. Now, the tables had turned. Mariah seemed to retreat behind invisible walls whenever the subject came up, insisting that some truths were too awful to share, too dangerous to expose. As Mariah neared, she kept her head down, clutching her arms as though to shield herself from the vulnerability that threatened to pour from her. Tessa rose from the bench, setting aside her guitar with deliberate care. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Mariah," she called softly, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm here. You don't have to do this alone." Mariah froze for a moment, the weight of her fear palpable. She looked at Tessa with eyes that seemed to shine with unshed tears. It's too awful," she murmured, shaking her head as though to dislodge the memories swirling in her mind. "There's nothing safe about telling you what I did. Not a damn thing." Tessa's expression softened to one of compassion. She closed the distance between them slowly, sat back on the stone bench, and patted the space at her side. "Sometimes the only way to find safety is by speaking the truth," she said quietly. "You've carried this burden alone for too long, and it's tearing you apart. I know you're scared, but I promise you, I won't let you fall. Not now, not ever." Mariah's shoulders heaved as she fought to hold back tears. She sank onto the bench beside Tessa, her gaze fixed on the ground. The park was otherwise empty, save for the distant hum of the city and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. Tessa waited patiently, no gentle coaxing, no prying questions. Simply a presence, a silent vow that whatever Mariah revealed, Tessa would remain by her side. The tension stretched before Mariah finally looked up, her eyes shimmering with the first cracks of vulnerability. I never wanted any of it to happen," she began, voice trembling. "But I made a choice, a terrible, unforgivable choice. And now it's out there, and I can't take it back." Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse under the weight of it all. But Tessa's steady hand on her back offered silent reassurance, and Mariah found the courage to continue.